Hello lovelies. In this video, the brilliant Dr. Edwards is going to take you through all the factors that are affecting biodiversity. This is for your A-level biology.
Factors affecting biodiversity. One of the main contributing factors to the decrease in biodiversity is the fact that the human population has grown exponentially. And this is really since around the Industrial Revolution. So that means we have more and more and more people living on the planet every year. This is because we have what we now call higher standards of living. So we have better medicines, better healthcare in general, and better food availability, so we can ship food all over the world and more people around the world have better access to food. And all of that is combined to mean that there are more people surviving and more people living longer, which is why the populations are increasing. The more humans there are on the planet, the more we're putting strain on the environment. And this is because we are taking over in terms of space and changing the land or polluting the land. So we're changing and altering ecosystems in order to grow food crops. So by growing food crops that maybe wouldn't normally grow there or making those the majority of the plants that are grown in an area, we're changing the way food chains and ecosystems work. We're destroying habitats, partly to clear land so that we've got space to build houses and also to grow food, but also in the terms of pollution as well. We're taking more resources from the natural environment. So things like mining underground, cutting down trees for wood, removing substances from the ground or from the land that we want and that we need. We're taking more resources and we're not necessarily replacing those, or they're not able to be replaced as fast. So things like fossil fuels. We're also creating more waste and pollution. So if you think about all of these factors getting worse because there are more humans, and so we need more food, we need more space, we're creating more waste. These are all the reasons why human activity is the majority of the things that's going to be affecting the biodiversity. Ultimately, this creates conflict between conserving the environment, trying not to have this effect on the environment, trying to keep areas protected and protect species, but also trying to make sure we can still serve the needs of the humans that are already here and in the future for the growing numbers of humans. So you can see on my picture here that there's 5 major sort of reasons and factors that are affecting the reduction in biodiversity across the world. So we're going to look at each of them in turn. Let's start with habitat loss. Main drivers of habitat loss are humans clearing land for agriculture, building, transport, mining, the space we are taking up, and when we chop down trees or clear the land of whatever was growing there before and move animals, having to force them to other places so that we can do what we want to do with that space. Habitats can be completely lost or they can be fragmented, so divided into much smaller areas. And often that means there's also no link between those groups, so sort of clumps of trees, but with roads between them or through them, and breaking that area down into a much smaller region. This can result in local extinction, so a species going extinct in that local area where it lived, and so there'll be no members of that species present, or inbreeding, which can reduce the genetic diversity of the population. So if their habitat is fragmented and a small group are isolated in a small area of that habitat and they can't leave, and other members of the species can't come into that small area of fragmented habitat, then they're only going to have a small group of organisms to breed with. So then we get lots of the same or very closely related organisms breeding with each other, and that reduces the genetic diversity, which we know is a negative thing because it means that population then is less stable. Deforestation is one of the most damaging as forests are highly biodiverse, so especially the tropical rainforests and areas like around the Amazon and large woodland and ancient woodland forests that have been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, which means that over that time, those trees and that area supports tons of species. It's the habitat, it's the food source, it's the environment for a large number of species. And so when you remove those forests that have taken hundreds of years to produce, then you are massively reducing biodiversity. Overexploitation. This is when resources are being used up faster than they can be replaced. Deforestation is an example because deforestation is happening faster than trees can grow back, and they're not always being replanted because that space is then being used for buildings or other things. Fish stocks, so just the numbers of fish in the ocean, are being reduced because populations aren't recovering fast enough. This is because too many fish are being taken, so the population left behind, there isn't enough for them to breed, or young fish are being taken, so they don't reach mature breeding age in time before they are fished. And this is impacting the birds and the other sea mammals that rely on these fish stocks for food. So it's impacting marine food chains. Hunting and poaching of animals still occurs in some countries, even if it is deemed as illegal. It's not always easy to control and make sure that people stop hunting and poaching these animals. And so in some countries, this is causing species to become endangered. Climate change. Ultimately, climate change can be summarised as more extreme weather events and global warming as a result of increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And a lot of that increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has come from human pollution, so the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation, so removing trees that are removing the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. One of the main impacts and reduction in biodiversity from climate change is that the species around the world aren't able to adapt to these environmental changes fast enough. So they're actually going extinct, being affected by these changes in climate so much, and they're not able to adapt through natural selection over time fast enough to be successful and adapt to these new environmental conditions. Species distribution is also changing, but this can affect ecosystems. So species distribution means where species are found around the world. So they're moving closer to the poles, further away from the equator, or species such as like mosquitoes and things like that are actually moving up from the equator in the tropical regions into kind of more northern regions as well. And these can have big impacts on ecosystems. So there's species previously partaking in food chains that wouldn't have been there before, and they could be outcompeted by other species. And so then they're not able to survive in these new areas they're moving to because of the temperature. The oceans are warming and becoming more acidic because the carbon dioxide is dissolving in the oceans and creating carbonic acid. So this is affecting marine ecosystems, especially coral reefs. They're being bleached. The algae that live inside the coral are being expelled. And so then they're not creating this symbiotic relationship anymore. Coral reefs are one of the most biodiverse areas we have in the oceans. They support many species. So that's really increasing the biodiversity loss there. It's also affecting crop plants. So where specifically you'd be able to grow crops in a certain area, if that temperature changes quite drastically, those crops may no longer survive, or they're being routinely damaged by extreme weather events that they can't cope with, like floods, hurricanes, droughts. And so we need our crops to be adaptable and to be resistant to some of this change. But that might mean that we can't grow them in certain areas until we've made them more able to cope with these changing environments. Pollution. Increasing the human population because there's so many more people means that we're producing more waste. We clear large areas for landfill, so where we are just dumping our rubbish that we can't recycle. And then over time, as that sort of slowly starts to break down, it starts leaching pollutants into the land around it. The burning of fossil fuels is obviously producing carbon dioxide, and that is increasing climate changes through global warming. Sewage and agricultural pollution is affecting our waterways. So where we dump our sewage waste that comes out of all of our toilets, and the agricultural waste, so runoff from things like fertilizers, is going into rivers and lakes, and this is polluting them, but also leading to things like eutrophication, where we get algal blooms and then the death of all the plant species in those lakes and rivers, which are then broken down by bacteria. The bacteria use up all the oxygen in the water, and so all the fish and larger organisms that live in the water die. Plastic pollution in the ocean is also leading to the bioaccumulation of microplastics and toxic chemicals. And this is all building up in food chains. And so you can literally kind of cut open fish from the ocean and find tiny pieces of plastic, because plastic doesn't biodegrade. It's just kind of breaking down and being ground down in the oceans to kind of tinier and tinier and tinier bits. And it's also leaching chemicals. And we don't actually know the impact of this effect yet, but we do know that it's impacting food chains in the ocean. Agriculture. So land is cleared to grow more crops to produce more food for the growing population. Agriculture will be the biggest thing on this list because it contributes to habitat loss and pollution, as well as like directly removing species from the environment. So As well as clearing land, intensive practices are used, which means that we're doing things like restricting the movement of animals, but also using fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides to try and increase yield. So to produce more food as fast as possible, because we obviously have a growing population. So there is an element that means we do need to grow more food. Hedgerows have been removed to increase the field size. And so this is obviously removing plants from the area. So that's reducing biodiversity. But also those hedgerows are really important habitats for a lot of other animals and food sources as well. Agriculture, especially large-scale agriculture, tends to be monoculture, so growing only one species over really large areas of land. That obviously reduces biodiversity, because if it wasn't growing there and weren't growing only one species, there would be multiple species in that area. Pesticides used to kill insect pests and herbicides used to kill weeds are reducing biodiversity as well, because they're directly killing insect and plant species. Fertilizers used to try and enrich the soil and put nutrients back end up leaching into waterways, as we said, rivers and lakes and things, and that is causing eutrophication. So if we just look at some images of this, you can kind of get the idea of the scale. Obviously, sort of the first image would have been what we would have done in terms of farming quite a few years ago. So smaller fields, different crops in each field, the hedgerows and trees all bordering around to act as kind of like delineations to say this is the edge of one field, and also this is my land, and then over the hedge is the other neighbouring farmer's land. Now that's been swapped for something that looks more like the picture on the right. So really, really, really large, massive areas of land cleared, especially if you look at the right hand side of that field, that is all forest. So that would have been all forest, but half of that forest had been chopped down to make way for just this one species. So we're removing habitats, we're directly removing species from the land, that decreases biodiversity. We're then replacing that with monoculture, so you're only replacing that land with one species. So that biodiversity of that sort of species richness there, species evenness is one. It's just one species, that's it. So there's less genetic variation, less genetic and species diversity in that area. That means there's less food and habitat sources for other animals. So when that land for the same area had all that forest on it, it could support a really high number of different species. When it goes down to just being one monoculture species, the amount of animals and other sort of food chains that area can support is basically none. The hedgerows that were all around the edges of these sort of fields back in the day, they provide habitat and food sources for a lot of different species. So think of all our kind of native hedgerow species, lots of birds, hedgehogs, lots of shrews and small mammals, whereas obviously they are now gone. And they also used to act as migration corridors. So the animals could move between the fields safely, not being picked off by predators such as owls and things like that. We use these kind of large farming equipment, like we said, for the intensive practices. So spraying insecticide, which is going to kill the insect species that are going to feed on the crop to try and increase the yield. But also that could spread and kill some other insect species around as well. Killing weed species to try and reduce competition with the plants also reduces biodiversity, and it impacts food chains around the area. So hopefully that's given you an idea about all the different factors that are contributing to the decrease in biodiversity in all areas of the planet.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I explain scratches.